about sin and redemption. Obviously, animals, they're not endowed with intelligence and freedom in the way in which we are.
Ours, irrational
So they're not capable of sinning in the way that we are. But nevertheless, our sin reverberates through the whole cosmos.
That's what Paul says, yeah.
And so, like, you think about the way that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about our original endowment, or our first parents' original endowment, original justice or rectitude. There was a kind of order or harmony between men and God, within men themselves, but a harmony that radiated into material creation. And so you hear this in Genesis 3, after the fall in Genesis 3:5, there's like a discovery and then a pronouncement of punishments, as it were, or like a kind of rebellion grows up in material creation. And so there's a sense in which, having lost this harmony, now we experience a disharmony. And so I think it's not insignificant to say that some of this may be attributed to the fact that we've sinned. And as a result of that, there's a kind of something amiss. Not to say that, like, well, we totally totally transformed the actual conditions of material nature. So there's no way in which,
Yes.
Animals still would have eaten antelopes in the garden because they have the teeth, they have the nature, which is upbuilt by meat. And as a result, we can judge that that's probably baked in. That's probably part and parcel of the creation.
Yes.
But it seems like our sin has probably made this worse.
This seems like a theological data point, that somehow the creation is subject to frustration through sin, and it's hard to like cash this out. And of course, in a sense, the atheists are going to hate this too, but you can't really cash out theological doctrines and empirical sciences, right? But there is a sense that our sin, as it affects us, also affects the nature of the world. You don't need to bring in demons necessarily, but of course we'd be silly to not think that they're involved in some fashion. It is the case, of course, that in the garden or in the local lake with sharks, that they would have indeed eaten things with their teeth. C.S. Lewis at one point says, like, in sharks, in heaven, maybe they'll do something different with their teeth. And it's like, nah, the great white shark is just he's just kind of an eating machine. That's what God designed him to glorify him by. But the idea that in somehow creation itself is not a right. I think it's hard to pin down exactly what's going on there, but sometimes with theological claims, and perhaps this is what the magisterium right now is talking about with creation, this is the good side we could take to environmental stuff, is thinking more seriously about that doctrine and what it means, and then the notion of its subjection to sin by us and otherwise, and to make sense of reality in that light. I don't think that's a silly request of the magisterium's work, and it's something I don't spend a lot of time with. But there is this sense that the restoration is a reunification, a reordering rightly, not only in our own bodies, but around the creation. How that looks and pans out, of course, no idea. But because spirit and matter are related to each other in the creation, then we should expect some right ordering.
Yeah, and I think, too, like, you've made mention of a theodicy. There's another kind of approach to these questions called a defense. Mm-hmm. They try to do different things, or they supply explanations in different ways. But I think something that's super fruitful in these types of conversations is making sure that we know what we're talking about. So, like, we've been using animal pain and animal suffering interchangeably. Some people, in talking about evil, they'll highlight the fact, like, evil's a privation, right? It points to what ought to be there and isn't there. Yeah. So in a certain sense, it doesn't require an explanation insofar as it's not. Yep. And yet, we experience it, or the phenomenon itself kind of oppresses us quite acutely. And so we need to be able to tell a story, or we need to be able to render a defense that what we hold in the face of this is at the very least not irrational, but might even have reasons to marshal in its defense, or kind of beautiful explanations whereby to account for what is. And I think here, like, you see certain animal pains and or sufferings, and they seem so terrible, that we're also contending with our emotional experience in light of that fact. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should say that this is suffering, because suffering is typically understood as an interior pain, right? Or a pain of one who can ponder the pain, or who can experience the pain in all of its acuity. Yeah. So I think, too, like, it's helpful just to talk about what types of distinctions or what types of clarifications help us to not, like, bracket our emotional experience, but contend with our emotional experience, lest we import our emotional experience and say something that's false. Father Jacob Bertrand, would you say that you're optimistic about this subscription appeal?
No.
Would you say that you're optimistic about anything?
No.
Well, I am. Folks, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'd greatly appreciate it. Cheers.